So we come to the third installment in a progressive rock piece that I've been very excited about. These guys came on the scene back in 2014 for me with their self-titled debut album, and for me it was the best album of 2014. It won the Notes Reviews Album of the Year. I loved how optimistic these guys were in a subdued symphonic approach. Something like that hadn't been seen before since like Going for the One from Yes, and it was a style that had been put onto the shelf. Like a lot of the times whenever we're in a symphonic approach, it's very huge, but this was very intimate. It was very small. The follow-up that was released the year after, it didn't quite hit the mark for me. It lost the spark that I fell in love with the band. So now coming into the third installment, where are we going to land? Let's find out.
All it gets mixed up, mutated, transposition, regenerated live.
Vier by Perfect Beings. Perfect Beings is a, I can't even say new conglomerate because they've been around now for about 4 or 5 years. This is their third project, and this is a double discer. This is being presented in 4 distinct tracks. Each track is subdivided into minor tracks, and these minor tracks kind of serve as their own entity in a larger scope. And in some ways this works very well. Like when I first heard this, I just listened to it as an overall album without these distinctions and differentiations, and I didn't quite latch onto it all that much. I felt like it was very long, it was overblown. When I actually looked at the track listing and I noticed that each of these were kind of clumped into each individual song, I sat down and I listened to each song kind of on their own, like each movement. So like the first one being Garda, the next one being the Golden Arc, the next one being Vibrational, and the last one being Anunaki. Each one I would listen to on its own. And in this sense, it vastly improved the enjoyment I had with this album. It provided a little bit more of a smaller bite-sized chunks of music in that sense. It is much more subtle and subdued than the past 2 works. If I were to kind of equate this, the past 2 works were much more concentrated efforts, whereas this one, it's the same amount of substance but in a much grander pool. And in some cases this works because it allows you to really get into the music and really kind of stretch your legs in the atmosphere that's being brought here. The rhythm section is key, and this is why I love this. The main drummer on this album really needs to get a shout out. Like, he is on his game. There's no low point within the drumming styles. He knows when to add those extra flourishes, and he makes it sound so easy, but he also knows when to bring it back and be very subdued and just like that little bit of an extra hint. The main bass lines on this album are the same case. It's very reminiscent to like a Chris Squire, where he knows when to take center stage and he knows when to be background. It's so refreshing to hear a bass line that isn't just following the main guitar riff. Like, it's another instrument. Why aren't you using it to fill up the space of the song? These guys do. These guys fill up that space and really play within that sandbox. The main keyboards and guitars, it's serviceable, which is a little bit of a drawback. What I do like is with the keyboards, there's a lot of arpeggios, there's a lot of sweeping soundscapes. Like, of course, I'm going to be drawn to that. I really enjoy that kind of a playing style. Very reminiscent of like an atmospheric approach and very background noises, but less so in terms of center stage. Same with the guitar work, which is a little strange because if you think about it, the only times that we have like a center stage presence is within the drumming and within the bass line, which is a little bit of a switch from the status quo within music, and I'm all for it because it really worked. But yeah, there was no like moment where I was thinking back and being like, oh man, that was like a brilliant center stage guitar work, or man, that keyboard solo just blew me out of the park. It was more of like the atmosphere and the ambiance of the music came together in such a very well deserved way. The lead singer is also on mark on this. Like, he's been a constant highlight on this album, and I love the harmonizations that we found on this. And so let's actually dive into some of the actual tracks. Now, I'm not gonna talk about each individual track. I'm going to talk about each larger piece that encompasses them. So the first one of Gandra, love how this starts off, and I love how within each of these kind of like sections, like the 4 sections, there's a beginning, a very clear middle, and then a very clear end, where there's kind of a reintroduction of themes. And within Gandria, we have it starts off very similar to, say, like a Gentle Giant, with a very quick, very speedy, punchy kind of vocal work on there with the harmonizations. And the time signatures are very akin to, like, a, say, like a Discipline era or a Lark's Tongue and Aspect era of King Crimson. This one is probably the most realized and crystal clear of all the tracks. The first half of the song is very, like, potent, very concentrated, and then the final stretch of this is the play out. It's the finale. It's kind of just the slowly we're coming into the first quarter of the album. Now, the Golden Arc is definitely one of the more trippy moments on this album. This is the soaring soundscapes, very similar to, say, like a full-on soundtrack. And the moment that we come into the next part of Turn Off the World, it bursts into flourition, and this is one of the heavier tracks, one of the most heavier moments of Any Perfect Beings. And this sequence is very trippy, experimental, being very dark and very cold at the same time, especially within just these 2 minutes. And this is where, again, we have a very complex time signature after such a bombastic moment. Pound for a Flesh is exactly why I come to Perfect Beings. The play out of this just lets it wash over me. It's one of my favorite moments that the band has done up to this point. It's exactly what I wanted. Like, everybody's playing in their own little style. Nobody's outshining anybody, and it's the perfect midpoint as well. It's a great closing piece to this overarching the Golden Arc overarching sequence. So Vibrational, let's talk about this guy. This starts off the second half, and it's the third piece of this, and this is an interesting one. Like, on the one hand, it's very unified. Like, the first 3 or 4 albums of this, The System Beyond, Mysteries Not Answers, and Altars of the Gods, and even the fourth piece of this, If Everywhere at Once, they're all kind of one unified entity. And it does go all over the place, as I mentioned before. Less cold than the past suite, but still that same kind of on edge, not quite knowing what's going on, very soundscapey, while still being very unified and very succinct as well. I love where it kind of gets into that ooh, ha 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 from Everywhere at Once. Very trippy, very out there. And again, like outside of like that first song of The System and Beyond being the very big starter track, and then the follow-up of Mysteries Not Answers, Altars of the God, Everywhere at Once being just a few minutes at most. The issue that I have with this guy, though, is the closing piece of Insomnia feels very disjointed with the rest of this track. Like, it felt like Everywhere at Once was a very clear end point, and then having Everywhere at Once being the closing point of this felt a little disjointed. It didn't quite work all that much for me. And Insomnia being a very beautiful and very somber moment. Like, the rest of this piece is very chaotic, and this one being very somber and very unified. It was very interesting that this is how it ended it, because it blends very well and almost starts off the final one of Anunaki being like the final suite. Insomnia. And so let's talk about the final suite of Anunaki, because this is where I think it starts to fall apart a little bit. Like, I think this is where the band, their grasp was a little bit further than their reach, because this is the end suite, and Lord Wind, as well as Everything's Falling Apart, they're kind of calling answers. And when I first heard Everything's Falling Apart, I was very confused as to this being the final piece on this album. I felt like it didn't really have a good punctuation. Like, it didn't quite end the album as much as I was hoping it to. Now, It does tie into the main theme that we had from the Lord Wind, but it didn't quite finalize it. But that being said, some of the middle pieces are still like fantastic, like a compromise. Whoa, so good.
Frankie broke free, his secret revealed, the new order calling him, you are a part of us.
But this final suite is also very disjointed, like it doesn't feel as unified as the other 3 suites. Like there's a lot of stopping and going, there's a lot more dead stops, which was a little bit of a shame. Overall, this album was a definite improvement from their second album. Maybe not quite as on par as their first. Like if I were to put this would be like just under their first one. This is definitely one that I'm going to be listening to again and again and again, because it is one of those few albums that the more I listen to it, the more I get out of it. It's definitely kind of that impressionist style of art where the more I put into it, the more I get out of it. I mean, if I were to rate this album, this is definitely the poster child of a pick this up in physical format. This is one that you'll definitely need to listen to on a turntable, because this is how it was meant to be listened to. If you listen to it on like a streaming service, you're not going to get why it's presented the way that it is, and you're going to lessen your enjoyment out of it. Last little tip that I will leave this with, because I think it's the best way to summarize it, is there's not a lot of perch on this album. This feels like if you were a bird, you're flying up in the air all day, not landing. You're not getting any grounding into it. And in some ways, this is great because you get the vast landscapes, you get those soaring sounds, those soaring landscapes, but you don't get that moment. Whereas the first Perfect Beings had a lot of those cliffside perches. I hope that those perches will make themselves evident throughout multiple listens, and I have a feeling it will. So that's about it from me for Vier from Perfect Beings. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, let me know by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.